Hello guys, I hope everyone's having an amazing summer, and I wanted to do another book video specifically dedicated to summer books. And this summer I've been gravitating a lot towards stream of consciousness books, which is a specific style which is kind of supposed to reflect the way that life might feel. That sounds a little bit vague, but it's basically characterized by fleeting images and movement between images and senses and descriptions, and it focuses more on this style of flow and these like crafting distinct images rather than maybe the narrative, if that makes sense. So I have 3 books of prose and 2 little poetry books that I wanted to talk about and recommend everyone to read this summer. I think summer is just the perfect season to read stream of consciousness. I think that especially if you're going on holiday, the season just feels very much the same as the stream of consciousness style. When I look back on summers, it's often these distinct moments, distinct holidays and things just often like pop out to me. The first book I'm going to discuss is one of my favourite books of all time, and it's Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. Virginia Woolf is one of my favourite authors. I'm also reading The Waves right now, which is also really good, but To the Lighthouse will probably remain my favourite. Like many other of Virginia Woolf's books, this is about the passing of time and the experience of being human, more specifically in the context of a family, as we see the Ramsay family and their children, and it kind of follows the relationships that they have with each other and members outside of the family, and it all comes back to this central motif of the lighthouse. I find this book so unique because of the middle section of the book. So the first section is like this, her signature like stream of consciousness style. Then in the middle of the book, there's this passage where the house that they stay in for a holiday, where the first part of the book is set, is abandoned as they go back and everyone lives their lives. And it's kind of a third person perspective. It's about the sheer passing of time. It's about the waves on the shore and the nights when no one's in the house and the light from the sea is reflecting in the windows, and it's just so beautiful and striking. The book is partly autobiographical, and it's like heavily suggested that Mr. Ramsay is based off of Virginia Woolf's own father, who was also a philosopher. And there's a part in the first section of the book where they're discussing the work of the patriarch of the family, and someone asks his son, oh, what's your dad's like philosophy about? And he says, if you think of a kitchen table and then imagine like the table existing without you being there. And that sounds kind of elementary, but I feel that that's basically what the second half of the book is reflecting on, the nature of existence and the world without human interference, and the way that the places we live in and the settings we construct around us continue to exist outside of our perception, and the cycles of the days and the years and time passing. I don't know if I'm just saying words right now, but I hope that made a little bit of sense. Anyway, I just find this a really beautiful and poetic book. That's another thing about the stream of consciousness style. It's also quite closely linked to poetry. I think the way that transient images are used and the focus is on images and sensations rather than narrative is obviously quite close to a lot of poetry, which is why I've included 2 poetry books in this recommendations video. So I'm going to talk about the first poetry book now, which is Blue Horses by Mary Oliver. So this book, I actually read this in late winter / early spring, I'm pretty sure, and I never read Mary Oliver's poetry before, but I know it's very popular and it was very touching and striking, and it kind of reminded me of To the Lighthouse. in these like little moments that Mary Oliver writes about, where it's like the act of watching nature and watching nature unfold by itself, and your role as a human observer when you kind of want to interrupt but you can't because you have to let nature take its course, if that makes sense. And the kind of like silent beauty and the art of observation and being a passive part in the world around you without feeling the need to take action. I think that's also a very feminine trope in literature, is writing about being a silent and passive part of the world and the feeling of the world kind of passing you and observing rather than acting. And I'm in no way saying that like it's feminine to be passive or something like that, but I think it's just very interesting the way that the societal emphasis and value is on observation, maintaining looks, like very emphasized on aesthetics, and this kind of translates into these female writers' meditations about the act of observation as opposed to action. I just think that this was a lovely collection of poetry. I interpreted it as, in some ways, a rebellion against capitalism, in the sense that this one particular poem was about labour-free blueberries from South America. And I think that kind of maybe is a commentary on the way that human relationships and our relationship with nature is maybe like plastered over by our relationship with products as consumers, if that makes sense. So, you know, when you see like a pack of blueberries in the store and you want to buy it, then you don't like see the countless human interactions and that overarching interaction with nature that led these blueberries to be in the store for you to purchase. I don't know if I'm reading too much into it, but yeah, anyway, I really enjoyed these poems. This is a really short book as well, so, you know, I really recommend this. The next book I wanted to recommend was Clarice Lispector's Near to the Wild Heart, and this is my first novel of Clarice Lispector that I've ever read, and I think it's also the first novel that she's ever written, which is kind of funny. It was very striking. Her like stream of consciousness style is so unique, and it is genuinely very disorientating, and I know that that's her intention. I don't think that's a negative point of the book at all, but sometimes I would just like, you know, when you start auto reading, but you cannot do that in this book because you will like drift off, come back, and it's like a completely different scenario and you have to reread the page again to figure out where you are, which I love because she keeps you on your toes. And yeah, I found this book amazing. Something that I also found a common theme with this and To the Lighthouse is the idea of like crossing boundaries, and this is, I think, symbolized by the mist. That is a motif in this book. Often there's like a mist described, whether it's physical or metaphysical. At one point she describes it as a mist over the present and only the past is clear or something like that. And there's also the idea of water, especially in the first half of the book. So this book does have a kind of loose narrative around childhood and growing up and the experience of being a woman and having to find a partner and being caught between societal expectations and things like that. So the first half of the book, when it is kind of like more focused on childhood, even though it does go back to childhood throughout the book, that is like when the narrator has a very strong connection to the sea and the waves, and she feels really at home when she goes to the ocean. She feels like she has a conversation with the ocean, and I feel like that comes back in her adulthood as this mist. Maybe that's like a way of her further like communicating with water, if that makes sense. I also think that the sea is quite significant as it also reflects the young girl's like emotional torment that she goes through on the death of her father. She's confronted by these like waves of emotion, which, you know, reflect like tidal waves. And it becomes so intense to the point where she arrives at her aunt's house after her dad dies, and she runs out on the cliff, and there's like this really poignant moment, and she just feels like she's gonna throw up, and she just throws up on the side of the cliff. And that moment is kind of the one that stuck out to me so much throughout the book, and the one that I really think of when I think of the motif of water in the book, because it's about like the overwhelming emotion and like a surge, and then that also like physically releases itself when she throws up. There's also a lot about boundaries, as I said before, and these are kind of represented in physical spaces as well. So as the narrator grows up, she becomes attached to this window, and there's like repeated episodes of her like just staring out the window, and it's like her face goes grey and she's just observing the world around her. And then there's like the significance of the physical space of the window, and like a few times like she'll be looking out into the nature outside, and there's a lot of reference to the stars and feeling like she's a part of the stars and blending together. But then she's kind of brought back into herself by the tool of like the mirror, which reminds her of her own finitude and her like physical existence, which differs so much from this like celestial plane that she almost projects herself onto when she thinks about the stars and the moon and everything. Anyway, I found this a really beautiful and poignant read. I'd really like to read more of Clarice Lispector. I've got another one of her books called Hour of the Star, which I will definitely be reading at some point this summer, and I'm really excited for that. But yeah, I really recommend this. Okay, the next book is also a novel of childhood, and it's a very famous one at that. It is the first volume of Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time, and I read this in May, and I put this in my May books video, so I have already like discussed it on YouTube, but I did want to mention it again. And I have been reading the entire collection of books. I'm actually about halfway through the third one right now. I read the second one in June, and the third one will be for July. So they are forming a very nice narrative right now, but I know that the first one is definitely the most famous. Whenever I go into a bookstore, and I just gave up trying to look for the third in physical bookstores. I found the second one pretty easily, but the third one, yeah, it was just not happening. So I did order it online, and I feel I will have to do the same for all of the other volumes after that. But anyway, if you're wanting to get your hands on this, it should be pretty easy to find. But again, this is, I don't know if this is like technically stream of consciousness. I mean, to me it is, but the way that Proust writes about specific incidents and striking memories is so unique, and it stayed with me for so long. And especially in this book, I think because the way we see things in childhood is kind of intensified, and there's so much emotion and, you know, the feeling of like growing up, but your kind of first interactions with conflict and with like discovering yourself and feeling at odds with your emotions at times, that makes childhood a really intense experience in a lot of ways that we maybe forget as we grow older. But I think that this book does a really good job of reflecting these intense emotions and intense relationships and like fixations we have with certain people as children. This is just an amazing book. As I can't really say that much more about the plot other than it's a novel of childhood. It is divided into sections. There is a little section in the middle, I think, where it's about like a small jealousy story, which is, it's obviously still in the same style, but yeah, it gives you some kind of like narrative information about what happened before and things like that. It is just a very good book, and I really recommend it. Okay, the next book, I've also discussed this in my favourite books video, but I wanted to include it in this one because I think that this is such a good little book of poetry to pick up during summer. I really gravitate towards reading poetry and like light fiction, and, you know, fiction that is, like I've said, like deals with images, and poetry is obviously the perfect example of that. This is one of my favourite books of poetry just because of how, first of all, how poignant it is, reflecting on the context that this was published posthumously after Plath's death, and the way that themes of like death and the self are like interwoven in this book is really beautiful and complex. There's a lot of reference also to passivity of the self, like being a object and being aware of external forces surrounding you and overwhelming you, but like kind of being unable to do anything about it. And there is also a lot of poems about motherhood and about relationships between women that I found really beautiful and fascinating to read. I reread this little book of poetry quite a lot. I think I reread it like about 3 times this year, and more recently I read it during the summer. And I would just recommend this like 10 times over The Bell Jar. The Bell Jar isn't a bad book, but I really enjoy Sylvia Plath's poetry a lot more. So those are my summer recommendations, and I hope you guys try some of them and that you enjoy them, because I just like love reading fiction during the summer. Honestly, this summer I've been reading a lot more non-fiction just because I'm going to start uni in September, and I know I'm not going to have time to like read heavy stuff that I'm actually interested in that's not uni work by the time that comes. So I'm kind of loading up on like history and theory and stuff like that. But I also love a good fiction book on the beach during summer, and I think stream of consciousness fiction and poetry are the perfect genres for that. So I hope you guys are having a great summer, and I hope you have a great week, and I'll see you next week probably.